Hello, everyone. It is currently, I don't know, let's say Tuesday, January 24th, 2012, and this is Day 9 Daily number 406. Things are going well in the Day 9 Daily count. We had to rearrange it a little bit so that way we could be clever with Day 9 Daily number 404, but you know what we did? Be clever with that daily. So now everything is as it should be, and it's time for Newbie Tuesday. Newbie Tuesday, the wonderful, wobulous Newbie Tuesday that I botched horribly last week. For any of you who haven't seen that, I think it's a very important step to be completely comfortable with total, utter, miserable failure. So when I did last week's daily, I was so unable to focus that I couldn't complete thoughts. I rambled incoherently, and then I tilted really hard, and it's all up on YouTube and Blip. So whatever you do, go to youtube.com/day9tv, look up the fail daily, and you will find exactly that. Yeah! The topic that I tried to do last week is the same one we're going to do this week. It is late game. Oh, yeah! Or as I like to call it, when cool shit happens. The late game is both this liberating, delightful, incredible time in the game where suddenly you're free from trying to follow these build orders exactly and free from all the worries like when Banshee rushes happen and when this attack comes at that time, blah, blah, blah. And instead you are left only with judgment rather than calculation. You get to look at the situation and try to determine in this unique spot what is the best way to proceed. At the same time, though, it can be very, very scary, particularly for a new player, to be in the late game. It's terrifying because you don't have the safety of all your build orders, of all your standard timings. Things like, aha, this build is good because it gets me an expansion up, I hold off Marine rushes, and I hold off Banshee rushes. I love this build. Now all of a sudden, no one's telling you what to do. There's no clear path to follow, and everything feels yucky. We don't want it to feel yucky, so that's why today we're going to talk all about the late game. So what I've done, let me open up my notepad. That is right, I do use Notepad for every Day 9 Daily. We're going to talk about three primary things when referring to the late game. First and foremost, do I have everything that I want? And that's the equivalent of saying, I'm going to build a house, and I'm bringing my trusty toolkit with me. So, okay, I set it down and open it up. Do I have everything I need? For instance, if I have just wrenches, I'm probably not in a good spot. I probably needed things like hammers and screwdrivers as well. So we want to make sure we're beginning with the right tools. The second thing we want to focus on is the ultra late game compositions. The ultra late game compositions. For instance, there's this weird thing that happens in the mid game where we're building units that are actually, on average, not good units, and we don't really want to wind up with a lot of them. For instance, let's take Zerg. Zerg, the Roach. Once a Roach is on the battlefield, I'll be the first to say it. Sure, on Fun Day Monday, I love joking about, yeah, roaches are imbalanced. But the Roach is actually a terrible unit. Once it's on the field, it takes up a lot of space. It doesn't have particularly good range. It deals damage kind of slowly. You don't want to be maxed on Roaches versus any maxed army. You will always lose. However, the reason that Roaches end up being good in StarCraft 2 is not because they're good on the battlefield, it's because they're so cheap to build. I can have 200 food with Roaches when you have 110 to 120 food of anything. Now we're talking awesome. No other unit lets you do that the way a Roach lets you do that. That's why it's good at that resources type thing. But when we get to late game, we can ask ourselves questions like, would I prefer an Infestor or a Roach? Because money's not an object in the late game. If I can replace all my Roaches with things like Infestor Broodlord, I'm very much so happier with that than with just Roaches. Zerg's pretty standard. Other late game compositions. For Terran, a lot of Ghosts versus Zerg, as opposed to a lot of Marines. that late game transition. And you know what the third and most important thing of late game is? This is the most important thing ever. It actually happens before the ultra late game transitions. It's the most important thing ever. It is the unit movement and expanding. The most critical, linchpin, basic decision-making thought of all mid and late game. Period. So, do we have the right tools to begin with? Are we having a good plan of what ultra late stuff do we want to get to? And how do our unit movements and expandings work properly in those mid and late games? Because this is a Newbie Tuesday, this is directed towards the lovely folks in the Bronze to Diamond League and perhaps even the Masters. But in particular, that expanding and unit movement, the relationship between those two, is something that even separates some of the mid-grandmasters to the GSL Code S players. It is so important to perform that well. But let's not jump right into that right away. Let's just begin with the first ever thing that we're going to begin with in this day. We're looking at a game between Liquid Hero, playing under the ID OGS Hero, against some guy. I will note that this replay is available on TeamLiquidPro.com in their This Week in Replays number 14, I want to say. Delightful thing that Team Liquid does, releasing replays of their players every week. Delightful. I download all of them and I watch all of them. Cool. Before we do anything at all, let's ask that first question. Do we have everything that we want to have? We step into OGS Heroes base, and because we're dealing with mid and late game, I'm starting at the 15-minute mark. I don't care what happened before this point in time. As we look around, we see things like he has 3 bases up. Cool. How many bases do we generally want? Well, around 3 seems reasonable. That seems a-okay, just fine. Dark Shrine, we have a robo facility. That seems a little late. We might want to have that earlier. But we have our upgrades up. We have a lot of gateways up. How are upgrades doing? Ooh, 2-1. Tasty. Love those. We don't really have that many cannons up. I'm right now describing overall mixes of what I'm seeing and not seeing, but in terms of wants, what do we really want? We want to be having upgrades. We want to be having the ability to make a lot of units, production structures. We want to have all the variety of tech we want. Dark Shrine and Robo Facility. Why don't you name something that's missing for me? A Robo Facility. What's another thing that's missing? Either Colossus or Templar Archives. So already we can clearly see there's a couple of things that are gone from this picture that we're seeing. There's also differences in each race that you might see, but we can just go through that really fast. Let's say we're right about to begin the late game as Zerg. What would you envision? 3 bases, probably 4 hatcheries at least, 2 evolution chambers upgrading, Baneling Nest, Mutalisks with upgrade, and a lot of Ling Baneling. Terran, what would we see? Maybe against Zerg we would see 2 bases about to take a third. Maybe we would see a third, but we'd have 2 factories making tank, 5 barracks with reactor, starport with an add-on, and I think most importantly 2 engineering bays upgrading. If you can envision your ideal start to the late game and just look, you already have a beautiful place to begin fixing problems. So let me come back here and just look at this position. And I'm going to ask you a question that is completely contrived because this is my show. How did these players open? I'm not giving you time to answer because the answer is, who gives a shit, right? Did you see how sternly I drank that water? No one cares what happened beforehand. You'll notice that as we look at this map, I so far have only talked about Liquid Hero, but let's look at the entire map. The Zerg, who appears to be going a lot of spine crawlers because he's getting ready to go Ling Mutalisk. He has 3 bases. He has 4 hatcheries. He's even taking a 4th base right now compared to Liquid Hero. Hell, in the Army tab, we can see that Liquid Hero a little bit behind, pretty typical at this point in time. It looks even right now. It looks even right the F now. I will say shit on this daily, but I will not say F for now. And I think this is one of the most important lessons to take when analyzing the late game. My brother and I had this sort of fun experience when we came home. When I would come home from, because I played Ultimate Frisbee because I was awesome. I'd come home from Ultimate Frisbee practice, see my brother watching a replay, and he would say, oh man, this Terran player, he's crushing. He got his third base up so much earlier than the Zerg did, which is so unusual. Wow. But I didn't see that. I didn't know that. I had the opportunity to look and go, no, it's actually the Zerg has the clear advantage right now. I wasn't confused by what happened earlier on, which can be such a problem. Or, for instance, on a Friday night when I would stay in playing video games and he would go out and have a social life because he had a girlfriend at the time, right? He would come home after that and he would say, Sean, wow, that guy's winning really hard. And I'd go, whoa. I wouldn't have thought that before. Load up your own replays, and I recommend going to the 15-minute mark as an excellent starting point to just begin examination. Are you winning or are you losing? Because one of the hardest things ever is when you get pissed after a loss. And you come back and you say something like, God, I was so far behind at that point. Those stupid spine crawlers destroyed my Blue Flame Hellion harass. But if you look at it objectively, you were fine. You were actually ahead. Good stuff. So now that we've looked at Liquid Hero, we've identified what's going on, I want to begin talking about the most important thing of all time, movement and expanding. Now, you'll notice that I haven't actually looked at the game that much. I've literally just looked at this snapshot right now of what buildings he has, whether he has enough production structures, whether he has everything he wants. And I want to start talking about how he progresses forward. To do this, I'm going to refer to the flaw, the problem of the early game when thinking about the late game. In the early game, there's so much stuff going on. Oh my God, there's so much stuff going on. Let's take a very basic example. A Terran opens double Hellion against a Zerg. He expands and then begins going Marine Tank. How many Hellions does he make? Well, he makes a factory and then he swaps it and he has 2 Marines and he swaps it back and begins getting an upgrade. And then he has his orbital command coming up and he gets these extra barracks going up, but he has to make sure to get these add-ons at just the right time and begin the upgrades at the right time. There's a lot of this and that, and I want to get a drop in there, but I have to have enough tank defense and I got to build bunkers here and take the expand. And then you slow it down when you hit the mid-game. And suddenly in the mid-game, things stop being about these rapid, like, do I have my upgrades up? Do I have this up and that up and blah up? It all becomes about who is expanding and who is denying expansions. Let's look at this game in still frames. Okay, so I'm at the 15-minute mark right now. I'm going to skip 3 minutes into the future to the 18-minute mark. Look at the number of expansions, still approximately the same. This expansion is now up and running for Zerg. This bottom expansion is not. These expansions are not running up for Zerg at all. None in the top right corner. And Protoss is under a little bit of harassment. Now watch what happens in the next 10 minutes of the game. Let's sprint to the 21-minute mark. Boom, an expansion comes up. Whoa, now that's good news. You know what hasn't happened? Any noteworthy tech at all. How many gateways did we have? 6 minutes ago, we had 10. We still have 10. We've built a Templar archives. No more forges have come up. These buildings were already all built. The only thing that's really noteworthy is this expansion. As we advance forward to the 24-minute mark, suddenly we have another expansion up. Look at the mini-map. We now have 4 expansions with a 5th coming, and Zerg seems to have just lost an expansion. Come here to the 27-minute mark. Holy cow, we have a 6th expansion up as Protoss, and we're starting to move towards this base, but Zerg looks like he's slowly evaporating on this bottom side. What do we have? Well, we still have effectively the same mixture of stuff for quite some time, especially when compared back to this, whoopsie daisies, I went to 12 minutes. Especially when compared to the 15-minute mark. There we go. Thank you. So all I've done thus far is show that not that much has happened building-wise in terms of tech, building more units, getting all the structures we want. Instead, it's been more expansions coming up. 15-minute was almost the last decision point when it came to the cool stuff to build in the production tab. So what I want to actually do is come to this 18-minute mark, and I want to look at some of this in action. The important thing that you're going to notice is that as Hero is moving around the map, he has a lot of seemingly complicated decisions to make. How to deal with Mutalisk harass, how to put pressure on this Zerg that's taking the whole map, and who's building this giant mass of indestructible spine crawlers in the middle. And yet in all this, Hero still finds the opportunity to expand and to be aggressive. So let's talk about unit movement and expanding and how they relate in this example. Unit movement and how they relate. Cool. Again, the first question, did he have everything that he wanted? Second question, about the late game composition, which we're skipping over, so that way we can go to our third and most important question, how does he deal with unit movement and expanding? You're noticing that Hero's leaving a good amount of stalkers here. And look at this base. Hero's leaving a good amount of stalkers here. The rest of his army, which, by the way, ain't so big, is just moving out to middle, and here's an expansion that plops down. Now, because I left the Zerg camera on, you can see that there's nothing that Zerg can really do about taking this expansion. But the important thing is to envision it from Hero's point of view, where even 10 seconds ago, he hardly knew where any of the Zerg ground units were. The important thing is that he did see, as we back up another 10 seconds, he saw where these Mutalisks were. And he positions a couple of units appropriately, even warping in. Now, I want to note a kind of mental shift that should happen in your brain. In the early game, you're always thinking about what buildings do I get up? What upgrades should I get? Better make sure I don't lose to cloaked units. Better make sure I don't lose to a big scary rush. Stop that once you begin the mid and late game. What you want to be asking is, where are my opponent's units? Where should my units go? And where should I expand? So for instance, right now, there are units frickin' here. So of course Hero wants to keep some units here. Of course he wants to keep these units here. And that's actually okay. Because these units, a lot of Mutalisks, because 40-some supply is tied up in these Mutalisks in the top left. That is actually the hardest part of the mid-game. I don't want to call it the hard part, but it is the most difficult part of the mid-game. Is just identifying where your opponent's army is and how to split it up. Against Zerg, I would say it feels the scariest, but is the easiest. Mutalisks travel in big packs. If you can sense a big pack of Mutalisks by just glancing at it, sick. They're here. I can move out with a good amount of forces as long as I leave some back. And having 10 gateways does not hurt. Now to note, let's start talking about unit movement and expanding. Let's go to the Hero cam. All of mid and late game is about taking expansions and managing expansions. We saw Hero take this expansion, and notice he's moving his army down. Does Hero know that there's an expo here? No, he doesn't. Is this nearby this expansion over here? No, it's actually farther away. But Hero is still moving down because right behind his army is where he wants to build an expansion. This is the most basic mid and late game movement. Wedging your army in between his army and where you want to expand. And again, splitting his units up a little bit, so that way he can deal with some appropriate harassment. Now Hero is doing some little pokes around here and there. And before we step into the break for part number 1 before part number 2, I want to just note what is happening here and relate it back to the early game. The most basic maneuver in all of mid and late game, I will say again, you put your army between his army and your expansion. Fortunately, this game illustrates an exception to this rule. Here is the main army, here is the other half of the army, because it's here to deal with these mutalisks. That's fine. That's the skill in the mid and late game, is knowing how to split your army up to deal with these multiple threats. But I would say that the most important thing to do in the mid game is not to overcommit, not to get overeager, and to do tons and tons and tons and tons of retreating, pulling back, recollecting your army. And here's the analogy I want to leave you with before we go into part number 2. Envision the very basic Terran vs. Zerg opening game. Something that I actually described at the start of this daily. We open up with a factory that has a reactor on it in Terran vs. Zerg. We get those Hellions up to control the space. Nice. We have our Hellions picking off Zerglings, doing scouting in the middle, and that gives us the chance to take an expansion, to build a bunch of barracks, to start building tanks, and those Hellions harass his front, maybe take out some drones, but most importantly, keep him locked in and contained so we can get this set of expansions. Now, the funny thing to note is that a lot of people are comfortable saying things like, oh, hey, yeah, I'm taking an expansion because I have these Hellions and it lets me blah, 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 so I'm safe. But I'm going to rephrase that opening for a brief moment. When you have those 4 to 6 Hellions out, that is everything you have. Your entire army consists of 2 Marines and 6 Hellions. Your whole army is not trying to kill him, is not trying to end the game right now. It's sitting down and letting you take up an expansion. That is the same way that much of the mid and late game works, where you take the entire muscle of your army to take an expansion. See how the early game can be so deceiving because you're thinking about all these pre-calculated timings and all this stuff, when really there's a basic idea going on. Use your whole freaking army to get you an expansion. Look at the way Hero moves this army right now. Ba-dum-bum. His whole freaking army, save for a few here, that's fine, ignore those for now. His whole army moves out, allowing him to take this expansion. And look at him poking quite far forward. Look at the Hero cam as he moves around, securing all of these watchtowers, taking these expansions. This is the Protoss equivalent of a lot of Hellions in the early game for Terran. He's not attacking. He's not going for base. Look, he's sitting here. There's an expansion a few paces to the side, but he is not attacking that. He is containing, grabbing himself up some space to take an expansion. Yeah, buying himself time. Excellent. We're going to go ahead and take a brief break, and when we come back, I want to talk a little bit more about some mid-game logic, and we're going to blast through this game of Hero against some awesome Korean Zerg. Then we're going to take a look at a non-Hero replay and talk about some things that arise from that. See you in 3 minutes. Wahoo!